Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you giving up the evening to come and hear what we've got to say on the latest of EMS and laminitis and obesity in horses. If you've not met me before, my name's Jen and I'm the newest member of the Damory Vet team. Joining me this evening is going to be Katie Williams from Dengue Horse Feeds as well. And how we're going to run this evening is I'm going to speak roughly for about half an hour or so on the more vet side of things about EMS, equine metabolic syndrome, and laminitis, and things we can do to try and prevent this disease. Katie's then going to go on and talk a little bit more about feeding, about management, and recognising obesity in our equine friends. And then we'll hopefully have some time for questions. We've got the question little box that you can add to along the way, and we'll pick those up and hopefully answer any of your points as well. So we'll get going. Let me just try and share my screen, and we'll kick off the evening. So I started off with this slide. What is EMS? What is equine metabolic syndrome, and why does it matter so much? It's not a disease per se, more a collection of risk factors for endocrinological laminitis. Laminitis can be caused by other things, but this is what we're going to focus on today. It's a huge topic to cover in half an hour, so we're going to try and keep it to the main points related to this syndrome, and also how equine obesity plays into this as well. So, as you probably guessed, one of the risk factors is obesity in horses. And one of the main constant features in equine metabolic syndrome is insulin dysregulation. What is insulin dysregulation? Well, it's prolonged levels of insulin, and that's in response to the horse eating carbohydrates, or in simpler terms, eating sugars, which they find in all of their feed, but mainly the hay and the grass. And also there is tissue insulin resistance that comes into play as well. So we've got high levels of insulin in the blood because the body's producing too much in response to the glucose, or it's not getting into the cells correctly and it's staying within the blood. And again, why does this matter? Why do high levels of insulin matter to the horse? They matter because it can lead to laminitis. So it's really important to recognise EMS in our equines to try and prevent this unpleasant disease. I'm sure we've all seen pictures like this before, and this would be the classic presentation of laminitis. A horse that has 4 painful feet that's rocking back on its heels to try and take the weight from the bones within the hoof itself because of the inflammation that's there. Of course, it doesn't always present like this, especially to start with. It's often much more subtle. Those days, a horse maybe always a bit footsore, a little bit pottery, but he's fine, he's okay with himself. That can well be the start of laminitis in a more subclinical or subtle level, and often then they get tipped over the edge and it turns into this more acute and drastic presentation that we see here. So here we go. I'm really sorry about my terrible artwork. This is one I made earlier, and this is, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but on the left hand side we have a normal-ish looking foot. I say normal-ish because of my terrible artwork. And these are the bones within the foot. This bottom one, labelled P3, that's our pedal bone. This bone we want to sit within the hoof capsule, and we want it to be in line with the hoof wall. That's ideally what we want. This angle here, where these arrows are, We want that to remain the same all the way down, and that's where that bone should sit. It's kept there by these soft tissue structures within the hoof. These are called the laminae, and that's where laminitis gets its name from. Laminitis, so inflammation of the laminae. And I think of it a bit like Velcro, where the laminae sit like this. We've got the hoof wall joining to the pedal bone, and the laminae are there like Velcro sticking it together. What can happen when we get inflammation of those laminae is that stretching can occur, stretching between the two, and it's a little bit like the Velcro starting to open and get prized apart, and that integrity of the hoof starts to sort of crumble, basically. That stretching happens, that inflammation happens. This is when we get movement of our pedal bone. So you can see here we've got a smaller angle at the top of the pedal bone compared to the bottom. And this is what people talk about when they talk about rotated pedal bone. And you can see that the tip of that bone is now closer to the sole. We've got less sole from the bottom to the top, and this is what is causing the pain in horses with laminitis. This tip of the pedal bone and closer to the ground, and causing, it can be absolutely excruciating pain in these animals. These are big, heavy animals, even our smallest Shetlands. And then we have the weight of that animal on this pedal bone, which isn't all that stable in the hoof capsule anymore. Over here, this is just an image showing the outside of the hoof. You can see what we call these concentric rings. And that's just showing we've got more hoof growth at the back compared to the front. This is what you get more in chronic cases of laminitis, where over time you get more growth at the heel compared to the front. So we've talked about EMS, we talked about laminitis and how they link together, and most importantly, sort of what holds it together, this insulin dysregulation. But who is most at risk from this? Which of our horses? There's no hard and fast rules in medicine, unfortunately. You can get thin horses that suffer from EMS. You can get horses such as thoroughbreds, which you may not expect to suffer from EMS, and they do. But on the whole, this collection of risk factors, obesity is one of the big ones. And all of these horses here are obese. Katie, like I said, is going to talk more about obesity and recognising that in our equines, because really these photos, these are very common images of what we see in our leisure horses. Our leisure horses tend to be more at risk because they tend to be more inactive. Some breeds are harder to exercise. Shetlands, for example, donkeys, miniature horses. It's all harder to exercise because we can't get on them and go for a good long ride and a good long gallop as such. So often they do tend to be more at risk. The more exercise we can do, it helps the insulin regulation within the body. So, as I said before, the insulin dysregulation is an overzealous, too bigger insulin response to the glucose that the horses are taking into their digestive system and then into the blood. But exercise does help to naturally regulate that better. And also, the more a horse is exercised, this decreases the chance of obesity and fat accumulation, and also then increases energy expenditure. So we've got more calories going out because they're doing more compared to the calories going in, and that does reduce our chance of obesity. It's also how we keep these individuals as well. the term to describe these would be good doers. And they live on nothing, they live on fresh air, these sorts of breeds. And they don't, the problem is, take our Shetland ponies, they have adapted to be living in Shetland, very sort of harsh climates, much cooler than a lot of places we keep. With the elements, no nice stables to keep them in, just out on the moorland and eating the sort of shrubbery and heather and anything they can find really, and not rather than our rich pastures that we tend to keep our horses on now. A lot of the time we end up keeping horses on pastures which are very rich for our horses, things like dairy grass, designed to keep cattle. I know that our pastures down here in Dorset really are very, very rich. And these horses, they just can consume such a lot of calories from this sort of forage compared to what they were designed to be taking in. So we talked about the risk factors, who is most at risk, and we can take guesses. But the best way to find out whether a horse does have EMS or insulin dysregulation is to do some testing, and that's where us vets come in, I suppose. If we can do this either often it ends up being after a laminitic episode, but ideally we want to try and promote doing this sort of testing before a laminitic episode occurs, because really, what we want to do is try and prevent this occurring rather than react to it occurring. So there are quite a few different tests that are out there and available to do. I'll just chat about the two main ones that we do at Damory, and most first opinion vets will do. The first off is basically resting insulin. So what that means is the vet will come along and just take a blood sample of your horse at rest. They're just doing what they usually would do, your usual management without turnout or in the stable. Come and take a sample. What we're testing for mainly is the levels of insulin within the blood. How high are those levels of insulin? Because that will tell us whether it is disproportionately high and whether there is a risk to that horse of then suffering laminitis. The other one that we can do is an oral challenge or an oral sugar test. We tend to use a caro syrup, a corn syrup, which we would syringe into the horse's mouth. It's quite, anyone who's done this will know it can be quite a challenge. You often end up wearing more of it than goes in the horse's mouth. It's quite thick and sticky stuff. But often they quite like it because it is a sugary syrup. We give this to the horse an hour to an hour and a half before then coming and taking that same blood sample and sending that off to a lab to again look at the levels of insulin in the horse's blood. It also does tell us about the level of glucose and also fat as well. But the main one we're looking at is the insulin. I've put this little diagram in over here. I won't dwell on this too much because it does get a little bit tedious. But basically, when we're doing a test, unfortunately, no test is perfect in this world. We can get false negative results, we can get false positive results, as well as our true results. So what a false positive means is that you get a positive test result, but actually there's no disease there. Whereas what we want to try and get is as many of these as possible, so we have a positive result and there is actually a disease there as well. So this is where this oral challenge is a useful test, because that will give us more of these results in this bracket. So it picks up more of these animals who do have who do have insulin dysregulation and then also will test positive. So it's really good for diagnosing insulin dysregulation in these animals and then working out whether they are at risk of developing laminitis at some point. Where this one becomes more useful is this can't always be done because it is time dependent. Sometimes it's not practical to do that for whatever reason. These animals ideally need to be fasted before giving this sugar syrup, 3 hours to up to 12 hours beforehand. So sometimes it's not practical, and then we would suggest doing this resting insulin. But also, this can be useful in an animal that we know has had insulin dysregulation, but maybe we've lost quite a bit of weight, we're doing quite well, and we want to see what their general risk is when we return to normal management and normal grazing and normal feeding. So we talked about the risks, we've talked about testing to try and find out who potentially is suffering from insulin dysregulation. And now to talk a little bit about prevention. How do we prevent insulin dysregulation from happening? As I alluded to earlier, unfortunately, sometimes animals do fall outside the brackets of what's normal. You can get thin animals that suffer with insulin dysregulation. You can get obese animals which don't have insulin dysregulation and the associated problems with it. But our mainstay of preventing this is by reducing obesity in our horses. And I've got this says it all really. We need to increase the calories we burn and decrease the calories that are eaten, in versus out. You know, we want more going out than are coming in. It can be tricky. It can be really very tricky in our good doing horses, and trust me, I sympathise. I own one who also, as I say, looks at the grass and he's put on many kilos without even thinking about it. You know, we often hear owners saying there's no grass out there, there's no grass on the fields, they survive on nothing. Often the problem is that it seems like there doesn't look like there's any grass out on these pastures, but it's because our horses are eating it. They're eating it as fast as it's growing. And what we're struggling with now, of course, is this non-seasonal weather that we're getting. I mean, this year alone, in Dorset, there's been, you know, not many frosts really overnight. Grass needs temperatures above 4 degrees to grow. But most of the time it is above 4 degrees. We very rarely get any prolonged period of frost, very rarely get snow. I mean, there's been no snow at all this year. And, you know, our grass is consistently growing throughout winter, not just in the spring and the summer as we're sort of accustomed to thinking it should. So we do need to adjust our management and the way we think about things, bearing this in mind. So yes, we need to reduce how many calories come in, and I'm not going to dwell too much on this because I'm going to step all over Katie's talk about feed, about grass, about forage, and how much we should be feeding. But I will talk a little bit about the burning of the calories, because cardio, so getting the heart rate increase in our horses, really does help to improve insulin sensitivity, basically decrease insulin dysregulation. This is true in both in horses, but also in humans as well. What is surprising is how much exercise is required to help do this in horses. There have been some studies done to show how much of cardio or increased heart rate needs to be to try and improve the insulin sensitivity. So ideally, we want our horses' heart rates to be between 130 to 170 beats per minute. Bear in mind the resting heart rate is sort of between about 20 and 40, say, for over 30 minutes, 5 times a week, which is a huge amount. I mean, I hold my hands up now and I say, I don't do that with my horse, nowhere near with my horse. And I think, you know, we've got to realise as well that what we perceive potentially as hard work for our horses isn't in the grand scheme of things. Most of us really will be doing light work only with our horses. That's an hour's hack, a little bit of trot, some canter, 5 times a week. That's still light work. But you know, that sounds very negative. I mean, we've got to remember that any exercise, any movement, anything is going to help to improve burning those calories and keeping the weight down. And you know, I'm a big one for saying we don't have to get on our horse and be galloping around or jumping or doing anything traditional, even taking your horse for a walk in hand, doing some pole work on the ground, you know, whatever works. Especially we're going back to these our Shetlands, our miniature horses, our donkeys. Anything like that is going to help these animals to burn more calories. Of course, the caveat to that is our horses who are suffering with laminitis, and we need to correct the laminitis, to get over those acute bouts and make those horses comfortable. And going back to our lamina, our velcro within the hooves, make that stable again before we can worry about doing the exercise. But for those in that happy position where that hasn't happened yet, we've just got a horse who is overweight and you want to address that, then that is something to go on and do, and have fun with your horses and get out there and do things with them. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what medical aids we have available as well. I am a vet after all, so what do we have available to us? It is important to say that none of these are a magic bullet. The mainstay of treatment for insulin dysregulation, or EMS, the overall syndrome, really is weight loss management with feed intake and burning those calories. But there are some medical aids which can be helpful in this. So one that we often turn to is metformin, and some of you may have heard of it before from using it with horses, but it's licensed in humans. It's actually a human drug. It does have poor bioavailability. What does that mean? It means when the horse eats it, it's an oral tablet, not that much actually goes into the horse's body itself. A lot is just lost straight through the gut. But the idea is that it helps reduce the amount of carbohydrates, the amount of sugars going into the horse's system and into the bloodstream, and therefore decreasing the insulin response in these animals which have the insulin dysregulation. So it can be a useful tool. It can be a useful tool for those animals that we're doing quite well. We're doing quite well with our insulin dysregulation, but we're coming into a risky period. We've got, it's springtime, we've had lots of sun followed by lots of rain. There's going to be a lot of grass growth and a lot of sugars in that grass. Or for those animals that we've had to confine to small paddock rest or box rest with soaked hay only. And then we want to aim to return them to pasture, because that's what we want to do, is trying to correct the insulin dysregulation and return them to pasture. For those transitioning to that point, to try and decrease the insulin response, this can be quite a useful tool. We've got this high dose levothyroxine. This is used more in the USA than here. It's normally prohibitive because it's such a high cost. But this one here, I'd like to talk a little bit about that we started using more. Awfully long name, sodium glucose co-transporter 2 inhibitor. The name isn't important. What it does is it basically increases the amount of glucose that is lost in the horse's urine. So again, there's less glucose in the system, less in the blood, decreases the insulin response. It decreases the amount of insulin present and therefore lowers our risk of laminitis. So again, high costs can be prohibitive for some people, but we are starting to use it more and getting some good results in some of our patients. So it's certainly worth considering those horses that that are suffering from really bad laminitis, and we're sort of getting to the end of where we go. Those horses that do have a very, very resistant to weight loss, and some are. This can be a useful tool as well to get them through that. So I think I am pretty much there. Oh, the only other thing I'd like to say about medical aids, it's not really a medical aid as such, but another important aspect, again, which is probably outside the scope of this lecture or this webinar to go into, is the importance of farrowing and hoof care. Just popping back to my terrible pictures, and we've seen here this change in the angle. What happens is we get elongated toes, and that then makes the angle worse. It becomes a little bit of catch-22. So by working closely with your farrier, we want to try and correct it and gradually reduce that angle and bring this bone back into where it should be, in line with the hoof capsule. So regular hoof care is really, really important to keep those feet balanced and keep our horses as comfy as possible. And as well, the use of shoes can be really useful in some cases as well. So thank you for listening to my waffle. I hope it's been interesting and useful. Like I said, there will be time for questions. I'm sure some of you have put some on already. But for now, I'm going to pass you over to Katie to have a chat about the feeding and the management side for now.
Lovely, thanks, Jen. Give you, that's brilliant. I'll share my screen. So hopefully you're all seeing a slide, feeding and managing the good doer. If you can see my presenter view, I'm really sorry, but it's I have two screens at work, and for whatever reason I turn the screen off and I try and hide it, but it still seems to show. So apologies if you're seeing the extra slide. As Jen sort of outlined, I'm going to cover feeding and managing the good doer. So trying to give some sort of practical tips and some structure to the ration, because one of the sort of repeated questions and queries or feedback we get is that feeding can be very confusing, and there's a lot of information out there, and it's knowing which advice and which information to follow. So over the last few weeks and months, actually, we've been working with vet partners, which Damory Vets is part of, and some of the things that come up in discussion include some of these areas here that I've highlighted, really. So, and the reason for setting out now is that as we go through the presentation, you'll see where sometimes an acute issue may determine a different course of action to whether we're dealing with the long-term management of a particular case. And I think as vets and nutritionist professionals, and to some extent a horse owner's perspective, we have to weigh up what is the greatest threat to the individual at that moment. So to our horse, what are we going to prioritise? Because there's always, I suppose, well, nearly always, every action has a reaction. There's nearly always a consequence to taking some form of action with our horses. And as much as we would all love to live in a perfect world, we don't. So sometimes it's what's the least worst option available to us. But we have to do that in a sort of rational, logical way. So that's why situations change, and certainly the acute issue becomes a longer term management plan. And we may need to make changes along the way to reflect those different circumstances. One of the things that Jen and I were chatting about actually before you joined was this increasing awareness that too little fibre can increase the risk of ulcers and other issues, which we'll touch on in a minute. And it is a challenge for us to find that balance between providing enough fibre but not too much. And this was something that came out of a survey we did a couple of years ago now, I think, in that everyone's conditioned into thinking I've got to feed lots of fibre because that keeps them healthy, they're herbivores, which is great, yes, tick in the box, but what is the consequence if they start to gain too much weight and condition, even on a high forage ration? We then tip them over into being obese and at risk of laminitis. So there is a dilemma there. Which is the biggest threat? Is it the ulcers or is it the laminitis? So again, we'll talk about some of the ways we can hopefully find a balance there. And if people are confused by the diet and sort of how we break it down and structure it, as part of my PhD studies, I've been looking at ways we can simplify things, give it structure, try to be logical, and we came up with the mnemonic Go for Broke, which we've been using with students, both equine studies and veterinary students as well, when they won't necessarily have any knowledge of horses coming into vet school. So it's like, how do we think of these as horses and not in the same way as, say, pet animals like dogs and cats, because it is a different entity altogether, which again we'll touch on. And what does success look like? What are we actually aiming for? So and on that note, this is a condition score 2.5, and I've put BFS and BCS at the top there because we've used condition scoring as the name for this assessment of a horse for a very long period of time. And apologies, I default to it because it's just an automatic way, a word that's lodged in my memory. But we are trying to move a little bit more towards body fat scoring, because that is actually a little bit more of an accurate assessment of what we're doing when we assess these animals. And condition almost has a positive, or certainly can be used euphemistically, or they're in good condition, in inverted commas. Well, actually they are fat, and we need to start to use the word fat, because then we actually eliminate or remove one of these layers of mystery and confusion. So this is a horse called Chewy. He's on a colleague of mine's yard, and he was historically overweight. So this is the before. You don't usually get the after before, but this is the before, and this was him. And a lot of people wouldn't necessarily think he was that overweight. He obviously is. He's got those sort of creases in his neck, which you can see in the crest forming, but he is quite normalized by today's standards. But this is where we got him to. He's a veteran horse. He's been diagnosed more latterly with sort of PPID, and his prior to that EMS. And when he was in this condition, if my slide will go forward, sorry, going the wrong way. Here we go. So in this condition, he was getting repeated episodes of laminitis, and his owner decided, she really needed to take action, do something about it. And we get him down to a 2.5 out of 5 on the 5-point scale. And those episodes became much less frequent and basically went away for a very long period of time. So that's why it's so important. This is not a thin animal in the sense of being underweight or something that needs to be addressed. This is a healthy weight for an animal that's had EMS, has had episodes of laminitis, and has had PPID. Now, I put that slide up at some talks, and when we used to do them pre-pandemic in person, and you could almost hear the sort of intake of breath is like, oh, that's too thin. And people are sort of slightly allergic to seeing ribs on horses, but it is perfectly acceptable to have them in a condition score 2.5 out of 5, obviously on the 5-point scale, and that's a healthy weight for an animal that has had laminitis in the past. So this is what we're striving for in terms of keeping an animal at a healthy weight. And what's part of the problem? Well, my fat pony isn't as fat as your very fat pony. And the trouble is, the more we see horses getting bigger, the more normalized this obesity becomes. Now, these are both obese. So just because Slim Jim on the right and the grey pony, as we see him there, he's got so many fat pads and sort of almost like cellulite kind of appearance to it. Just because your Exmoor pony isn't quite as fat as that one, then doesn't mean to say you haven't got a problem. They both would be 5 out of 5 or 5+ on that 5-point scale. They're both at risk of laminitis and both need attention. So just because yours isn't the fattest doesn't mean to say you haven't got to take action. And it's, we have it with our own team when they go out to do weighbridge assessments and they condition score one at 5, and then an even fatter one comes out, and they panic a little bit. It's like, well, what do I do now? They're both obese. Okay, that is the crux of the matter, and they both need a diet plan to achieve some weight loss. So coming down to the sort of actual diet itself and what we can do, and we're starting with the grazing, so the G element of the go for broke mnemonic. Why do we need to manage grass intake? Well, Jen alluded to this perfectly in her talk about the fact that in the winter now, and certainly in the southeast, we're not seeing snow, we're not seeing prolonged periods of cold weather, and this graph effectively shows the energy value. So megajoules is the MJ, that's the megajoules of energy that's in pasture throughout the year. And what we're sort of referring to as the energy gap between what grass can provide and what a horse at maintenance or a horse in light work actually requires is very definitely getting smaller. So in other words, grass is making an even bigger contribution to their energy requirement throughout the year. So the yellow line shows the energy intake for a 500 kilo horse if they were just left out to grass 24/7. And this is average sort of UK pastures. And you can see that it only dips below the maintenance line, which is sort of dark blue black, sort of going across the slide. That little gap is very small. So it's only really in the depths of winter that the intake dips below what's needed to maintain a horse's condition. Now, obviously, if we start to do some work, and Jen's just talked about the importance of exercise from an insulin sensitivity, but also just from a calorie burning perspective as well, you can see it significantly raises the requirements, and therefore we're dipping below the sort of required line. So we in energy deficit, if you like, or we have an energy gap, which means that we have an opportunity to try and promote weight loss, even if the horse is at grass. As I say, I suspect that winter forage or winter grass is now contributing a lot more energy than it used to, especially in the southeast, and if we're not restricting access to it, and therefore the weight loss doesn't occur because they're just never in an energy deficit scenario. So that's something where we have to be mindful, and we have to therefore, if we've got a good doer, restrict access to grass. And we have a few options that we can look at for that. So we can take them off grass completely and have a no grass area, or we can limit their access to grass. And the two sort of systems, historically it used to be strip grazing was the main way of doing it, but also more recently we have track systems, and they're popular for a number of reasons. If you put the track around the edge of the field, it does mean that there can be some horses in the middle, so the one that's on the limited access can actually move all around the field with them. You're not trying to contain them to a corner when their friend's gone off right to the other end, which can cause them quite a bit of distress. So they can move to some extent around the field. And there are some really sophisticated and really sort of engaging and enriching track systems popping up in yards where they've gone to town with putting lots of different toys and things and to occupy the horse that might be on limited grass intake and give them some stimulation. So if you're lucky enough to have a yard that's thinking like that, it's great because they're actually being occupied and burning a little bit more energy, interacting with these toys and things that they're sort of have to challenge them and provide them with a bit of stimulation. But if for whatever reason, and some of us are on yards where we can't employ these strategies, so strip grazing isn't allowed, or we can't have a track system for whatever reason, so something like a grazing muzzle can actually be a good alternative. So we'll look at some of those in a little bit more detail. Now, this is what I would call a bear paddock. And in my day, we used to call them starvation paddocks, which is not a nice connotation. So that's sort of been replaced by these bear paddocks or wood chip paddocks. And I talked about the difference between a horse and some of the pets. So if you have a dog or a cat that needs to go on a diet, if you select a low calorie bag of feed and stop giving them treats, then effectively you've got complete control over what's going into their ration and into them. When you're dealing with a herbivore, and obviously in this case it's a horse, it's much harder because Forages and grass and pasture are very variable in their nutritional value. It's almost impossible to know exactly what's going in, because horses will eat at different rates, they digest it differently, the energy levels in a pasture will vary throughout the day, never mind throughout the year. So, it is very difficult. So if we can take them off the grass and eliminate one of those variables and put them on a truly bare paddock, it may be the best or the only way to get complete control over what's going in. Now, I know this is a perfect world, but there are more and more livery yards identifying the need for these sort of wood chip paddocks, if nothing else, sometimes to protect their own grass and paddocks in the winter. But it's worth talking to your yard if you don't have your horses at home, because if you can create something like this, it gives you that control. And again, this is when we're talking about what's the acute situation. If you've got someone that desperately needs to lose weight because they're borderline, or have laminitis, you've got to get that weight off. You've got to take action, and something like this is an imperative investment, really. Longer term, you may be able to use it in conjunction with some grazing once you've got the weight off, but there's such a useful way of just getting control and getting you back on top of the situation, if you have a good doer. So just again, some facts and figures, and sorry, it's a really wordy slide, but it just summarises the research that's been done on grazing muzzles so far. So Tracy Hammond, one of the nutrition team here at Zenji for her master's degree, looked at muzzles and seeing how effective they were. Now, it's not published data, but she found a reduction in intake of around 75 to 86%. Annette Longland et al. In 2011 found a similar restriction in intake. That is published work. So that's, again, a reduction of around 75 to 88% when using muzzles. And that was in a 3-hour period. So similar results there. And, obviously 75 to 88% reduction is significant. So they are, working, they are stopping the amount of grass or reducing the amount of grass the horse can consume. However, when we take those muzzles off, and if we're allowing them access to grass and pretty good grass, then they will compensate and they will consume a huge amount in a relatively short period of time. So you do have to bear that in mind. Even so, Annette found in some subsequent work that if you used a muzzle for 10 hours for a 24-hour grazing period, it may help reduce weight gain in some individuals. So our advice would typically be, if you're going to use the muzzle when you're putting them on grass, when you take it off, ideally bring them off the grass, put them on that wood chip paddock or in the stable, whatever you've got, to really get control, because then you're making a difference. Now, there are some I suppose now how many years in we are to muzzles being used, there is some sort of downsides, in the sense that some people are talking about incisor wear from the horse repeatedly grazing against the muzzle, and that seems to be particularly on these really sort of harder plastic material ones. So you do have to bear those in mind, but again, it comes down to, if we need to use them strategically or tactically for a period of time to get some weight off and cope with that flush spring grass, then use them for that period of time, and then in conjunction with things like wood chip paddocks and lesser amounts of grass in the summer perhaps, is part of a strategy that you can employ throughout the year to try and get control over what grass the horse is consuming. Do try to introduce them gradually. Make sure your horse is happy to drink and eat with them on. Some are very adept at getting them off, so you can sort of plait the mane or the forelock over the top to try and keep them in situ. You do also have to bear in mind that if they're wearing a muzzle in a group of horses and not everybody's wearing them, they are at a slight disadvantage because they can't use their teeth to sort of fight the bullies off. And that can be an issue, particularly for older horses or those lower down the social hierarchy. So just watch out for that. And we would suggest using for a sort of maximum of around 10 to 12 hours. They should be effective for that period of time, and say, bring them off the grass if you possibly can. So you can also make them a little bit more comfortable by using things like vet wrap around the sort of head collar part of it, so it is a little bit more comfortable and shouldn't rub quite so much. So if we're restricting grass intake, we have to supply an alternative, and there's no getting away from this. If we can bring them off grass, that's great, but we then do have to put something else in instead. So we'll look at the options for different forages that we have. Forage is important for a number of reasons. So we're using it as a source of fibre when there isn't pasture. Now, it's quite a sort of strange scenario, really. We don't actually know just how much fibre in sort of grams per day a horse would require to keep them healthy. We tend to refer to how much forage in kilos per day. So obviously in a forage, you have other nutrients and things as well. So it's not all fibre. And by forage, we're meaning things that have been conserved. So whether it's grass or straw or alfalfa, those sorts of materials that are high in fibre, but they're certainly not 100% fibre. So it's what's in the rest of that forage that often dictates whether it's the most suitable one to use for a particular individual. And as I alluded to in the context of ulcers, we know that forage is important for chew time. The chewing produces saliva, the saliva neutralizes acidity, and it helps to regulate acidity throughout the digestive system. So it's another reason why we want to feed forage. One of the aspects that doesn't get as quite so much attention, but it has been shown to be an issue in other species, is that when we put too little fibre in, it actually compromises the health of the cells of the gut. So colonocytes are the cells that are in the, certainly in the large intestine, the colon and things, where they have what are known as tight junctions. So the sort of junctions or the joins between the cells that line up are very tightly packed, they're close together, and that makes them sort of not impermeable, because obviously they have to let nutrients through, but impermeable to some harmful things like bacteria and other substances that the horse might ingest or produce as part of the digestive process. What seems to happen when we feed too little fibre is the fibre actually generates an energy source for the cells themselves as well as the overall animal. So if we put too little fibre in, those cells become weakened and the gaps between them are no longer tight junctions, they're less tight junctions, and the gut becomes more permeable. And we tend to refer to it as leaky gut syndrome. Now you can see how that might contribute to the problem of laminitis, which we know potentially originates in the gut, and things coming out, leaking through the gut can be a problem. So we just, obviously want to do everything we can to maximize gut health and try to keep the gut as healthy as possible by feeding the amount of forage that the horse requires. So the current recommendations for that in terms of the weight of forage required are 1.5% of dry matter of the horse's body weight per day. So even for a good doer. Now, this does generate debate because there are some papers, I have to say the older papers are the ones that will go lower than this. And we've spent quite a bit of time trying to sort of get to the bottom of the different amounts. But for the long-term management of a good doer and to take into account all the other factors for gut health, things like ulcers, this leaky gut syndrome, trying to avoid it, then 1.5% dry matter of the horse's body weight per day, even for a good doer, is what we should be striving for. And if we're feeding that amount and the horse is still holding weight or gaining weight, then it is far preferable to reduce the calorie density of the forage we're using rather than feed less volume or less weight. Okay, so that's the general principle. The more we can feed, the better. We've obviously got to find the lower calorie options wherever we can. We want more chews for less calories effectively. So as mentioned, what is forage? Well, it's these conserved sort of high fibre materials, and we can conserve them either by removing the water, so drying them, which would typically be things like grass, hay or straw, or we can wrap them. So by doing so, we take the air away, and that tends to be haylage, or more accurately these days, a wrapped hay. Now, if we sun dry these forages, then hay and straw, it takes a lot longer. You lose a lot more nutritional value from that forage because it's laid out in the field, taking a longer time to dry. Or we can use alternatively hot air. So it's an artificial tumble drying in effect, and that tends to be the mechanism used for chopped and bagged forages. So things like alfalfa and grass would be high temperature dried to get rid of the moisture quickly, lock in all the nutritional value. And then you tend to find that you get a cleaner forage as well. So if we're creating the anaerobic environment, making things like silage or haylage, then we do still need some moisture present for that fermentation to occur. So we wrap the forage, we take the air away, it becomes anaerobic, and then it allows, as long as there's sufficient moisture, the bacteria present to ferment the sugars that are in that forage and turn them into acids. And it's the acids that then preserve that forage. Now, what we tend to find is that people are drying hay, well, grass, to the point of it almost being hay, and then wrapping it. So a more accurate term is actually wrapped hay. And I just wanted to include this sort of slide in this comparison because it's really interesting information. It's one of the few sort of studies really that compares the different conservation techniques from the same field on the same day. So normally things like silage and haylage would be made a lot earlier in the season, so there are so many other variables that impact on their nutritional quality. By taking them all on the same day from the same sort of field, in effect, then the researchers at Cecilia Muller from Sweden, she actually sort of eliminated or reduced some of the other variables that exist. And what you can see there is effectively, if we take the silage, for example, because there's enough moisture, it's a very wet forage, there's sufficient there to create a fermentation, and therefore the sugar level drops and we're left with a much higher lactic acid level, a level of acidity. That's our marker of fermentation. Now in the yellow highlighted column, I've dropped in the sort of data that we do from our forage analysis for customers, where we're looking, and these would be typical of a wrapped hay, so 70 to 80% dry matter, much higher than a true haylage, which would be around 55 to 65% dry matter. Okay, so you can see because they're too dry, the sugar level is still up there comparable to a hay, and we've got no marker of fermentation, or not one that's worth really noting. So it just goes to show that actually, although we're wrapping a forage, doesn't necessarily mean to say that it's going to be more acidic, and it certainly doesn't mean to say that it's going to be more digestible, because actually it's pretty much a wrapped hay. Okay, so that's just to set the scene for a case study I've got at the end, really. So the top 5 factors affecting forage quality. Now, you may be lucky enough to make your own forage, which is fantastic because you can have control over this. But if you don't, and you are sourcing it from a local farmer, then it is worth talking to them, because if you know how much you want and you're buying for a period of time, they may well try to work with you on cutting and the harvesting factors that kind of help give you a forage that's ideal for your good doer. So generally we're talking with what kind of plant we're talking about. So obviously grass, silver straw, alfalfa is the sort of top factor determining what's in it and how suitable it is. Then when we come down a level from that, we're looking at what species that plant. So in the case of grass, it tends to be timothy or ryegrass are the two most common. Now ryegrass tends to be the higher sugar grass species, timothy less so, but that's not always the case. So some of these other factors will come into play and can override the species side of it. Timing, so maturity of the plant is the key factor, and it's not just the calendar month it's actually harvested in. Just make sure if you ask for a late cut forage, which is what you want for a good doer, that it's a first cut late cut, because I've had some cases where someone's asked for a late cut forage and someone's given them some hay from August, but it was a second cut. So it's actually a very young plant, even though it was taken late in the calendar year, it's the second cut. So the grass plants themselves are much younger and therefore more digestible, and in this case was much higher in sugar. So really not what they wanted for their good doer at all. So do be specific, first cut, late cut, ideally August if you can. And that's basically because it means it'll be really fibrous, less digestible, and gives you more chews for less calories. The weather conditions on the day can play a part. So generally speaking, more sun equals more photosynthesis. Now over a prolonged period like we saw in 2018, which was one of the hottest, driest sort of spring summers I can recall, we saw some of the highest sugar levels that we'd ever seen in forage analysis. And we've seen some similar, to be fair, since then, but they were up in the 35% water-soluble carbohydrate, which we're normally expecting somewhere around 17, maybe 20% in a typical UK hay. So it was extremely high, and we're certainly seeing a trend in that direction with these longer, sunnier spells that we have or do have in some years. And then the timing of the cutting on the day. So plants use sugar in the dark overnight. So they make it during the day when it's sunny. They're still sort of using it overnight. So their storage levels will drop. So if you can get your supplier, or if you can cut it yourself, do it early in the day if you possibly can, and try to select the sort of overcast, dull days, because it's likely that the sugar content in the grass will be lower given those factors. So they're all things that if we have the perfect world and we can choose our forage or work with our supplier, that we can try to do. obviously not everyone has that luxury. One of the questions we're asked a lot is reducing the sugar content of hay. How do I go about it? And is soaking the answer? Well, again, you ask 10 people and you'll get 10 different answers. At the Beaver Congress last year, there were some presentations on this, and one of the researchers there suggested, a hay to water ratio of 10 parts water to 1 part hay. Now, if we can achieve that, and you think about 10 kilos sort of hay net and 10 times the amount of water and how practical that is for most people, it isn't, is it, basically? So as a takeaway message, what we're trying to do or trying to get across is that the more water you can use relative to the hay, the greater the losses are likely to be. But obviously you've got to do what's practical in your situation. Similarly, with temperature, the warmer the water, the more sugar tends to be lost. And again, the work that's been done is sort of 16 degrees C water achieved greater losses. Well, in the depths of winter, there's no way you can sustain 16 degrees C in your water for a prolonged period of time. So try to do what you can. If you can use warmer water, it will help reduce the sugar. Timing tends to be dependent on some of the other factors. So the more water you can use and the warmer water you can use, the less time you tend to have to soak it for to achieve the losses. If you can do those things, then some are suggesting that a couple of hours is then sufficient to soak it. If you are going to soak for longer than that, then you need to change the water regularly if you can. Obviously, not all of us live on our yards or have our horses at home. If there's someone that can change it for you, if you're not going to be there for, say, 3-4 hours, that's going to be helpful. And especially in warmer weather, it will start to go off, and you are losing a lot of the other nutrients if you soak for a prolonged period. So my personal opinion is, if you can use a greater ratio of water and warmer water where possible, do it for a couple of hours. If you do need to do it longer than that, then do try to change the water if you can. But 2 to 4 hours really, once you're getting past that, you really are losing a lot of dry matter, so actual substance forage. And then ironically, you are actually having to start to feed more because you're not achieving the minimum dry matter intake the animal needs. So it becomes a bit of a vicious circle. So I think 2 to 3 hours is probably practical for most people to achieve. Obviously, the key thing is, if we can start with the lower sugar forage in the first place, then this becomes less and less important. And this is where straw can come in. And again, it does divide opinion a little bit. But the previous work that's been done suggested up to about a third of the forage could safely be replaced with straw. Now, a study published late last year, so December 2021, by Janssen et al., they, again, are based in Sweden. They found that up to 50% wheat straw didn't cause ulcers. So they actually replaced 50% of a haylage with 50% wheat straw, and they saw no adverse effects in terms of causing ulcers. Now, prior to this study, we did our calculations on the third of straw, and if we replace an average hay with 1/3 straw, we got a 16% reduction in the energy or calorie intake. Now, if you're replacing a better quality forage, something that's higher calorie, even at a third, you're still, your reduction in energy is going to be even greater as a percentage, because you're starting with something that's higher in energy. If you go up to 50% replacement, then we're probably talking around 20 to 25% reduction in energy intake, which is great in terms of trying to achieve some weight loss. And I think it's interesting to note that the reference text we tend to use for nutrition, the NRC, it's a published piece of work from the USA. It's a little bit out of date, doesn't get refreshed that often, but their sort of guidance is for a change in of a half a unit on a 5-point scale for the body condition scoring scale requires a reduction in energy intake of around 11 to 15% in the total diet. So you can see that if we're achieving a reduction by replacing hay or haylage with straw of around 16 to 20%, depending how much we're replacing, we're well on our way to actually achieving some weight loss, according to the NRC. Now, you can soak straw, you can steam it. Steaming is probably the most efficient way of improving its hygiene quality, but it is possible to soak it if you don't have a steamer available. And if you're using it in a long chop format, you can mix it into your hay net, and it may well help to slow some of the greedy types down too. And it may seem a bit wasteful, but actually if it takes some time to pick around it and they drop it on the floor and don't actually eat all of it, although it is a little bit wasteful, it is actually achieving something in sense of slowing them down. And one of the really exciting findings from the study that Janssen et al. Did, and it is one study, so we do have to put it into that context, but they found that because these horses were eating so much more slowly when straw was in their ration, it meant that there was a negligible insulinemic response in the evening offering of that forage. So I'm not using the word meal, but when they offered the evening forage, the insulin response was hardly even there, because it was trickling in so slowly, it didn't really have any impact. And when you're talking about insulin dysregulation and spikes in insulin as a result of meal feeding, these are some of the really big issues and risk factors. Well, this work is going in the right direction of showing that if we can slow the rate of intake, and it's something I care about quite a lot in terms of the bucket feed as well as the forage. It's such a crucial factor that we need to get right. So it's not just about the calories that we're putting in, it's how quickly those calories or that energy is being consumed as well. And basically, we've got to do away with this concept of meals if we're going to have any chance of getting things like insulin dysregulation under control. Do talk to your vet about the use of straw, because there are some situations where it wouldn't be the obvious thing to do. If you have a horse with poor dentition, an older horse, or history of impaction colics and things, do discuss it, because it may not be the right thing for everyone. But straw is fed widely around the world, and it's in chopped format in lots and lots of feeds that are widely used. So there is sometimes a little bit of, I don't know if stigma is the right word, or prejudice against it, but it can be a really useful feed ingredient for these obese horses. What about analysis? Well, it's only as good as your sampling. So if you are going to do a forage analysis, do try and take samples from as many different bales as you possibly can, mix them up, and then you're going to get a much more representative result. Carbohydrates, so whether it's storage forms, so things like water-soluble carbohydrates, fructan, etc., fibres, all those sorts of things are extremely difficult. They're just very irregular. They're not, there's a type of fibre called hemicellulose. It's not the same in different plant types. So you can see that for the labs and things, this is a really difficult thing to actually analyse. So do bear that in mind. Make sure you're comparing like with like. So if you are asking companies for information, many of them will publish it on their websites, or some will put them on the bags, things like sugar declarations, WSC. Do make sure you're comparing the same things, because some companies will give a simple sugar declaration and some will use a water-soluble carbohydrate declaration, which will actually include some of the storage forms of sugars as well. And they're going to look very different, but you're not comparing the same things. So it's not a fair comparison if you don't make sure it's the same analysis technique that's been used. You can also have an NIR analysis, which is basically a machine analysis, and you can also have wet chemistry, which tends to be more accurate. So again, do make sure if you're going to go to the trouble of analysing your forage, you know what you're getting. If you have some results, or you would like results from other sort of companies or other suppliers that you've got compared, we're very happy to interpret them for you. So if you're not sure what to ask for or what to look at and how to compare them, we're very happy to do that for you, and obviously impartially. So when you do an analysis, use it alongside what you know, can see and feel about the forages as well. The more like straw it feels in your hand, if we're talking about things like grass, hays, the more like straw they tend to be nutritionally. Later cut, more indigestible forages will tend to be lower in calories and usually lower in sugar. So use all of the information available to you. And the reason I've sort of put, again, setting up for the sort of case study at the end, if you analyse a haylage or a wrapped hay and a hay, and what the haylage is the one that comes back lower in energy than the hay, then if the other info you have supports this, there's no logical reason not to use it. Otherwise, why are we analysing? And I'll leave that hanging until we get to the case study. Obviously, if you are going to use a short chop forage for maybe an older horse that's got poor dentition, it seems counterintuitive because you think, well, they're not likely to be good doers and overweight, but believe me, they are very often. You can't quite believe how efficient these horses with no teeth can actually be. You may well need to use a short chop, and again, you've got to try and make it as long as possible, last as long as possible. So use these trugs, put balls on the top, smooth, really large pebbles, so there's not a chance that they can actually get it in their mouth, but it reduces the surface area, so they have to work a bit harder to get to the chop. And there's lots of foragers, small hold nets, loads of devices these days to try and slow horses down if you are having to stable them. So all of those things are out there, and invest in them if you can. So I won't dwell on this slide too much, but it's all the sort of take-home messages really from Forage, and this is all being recorded, so if you want to watch it again, or if you'd like the slides, just let us know if you would like a copy. I just wanted to cover off the bucket, the B of the go for broke mnemonic, really, because we often asked why good doers need a bucket feed at all. So this slide is our sort of ration planning program that we use, and if you put in there dieting sort of hay ration for a 500 kilo horse at the recommended sort of intake, then you can see the areas where we're supplying too little. So things like copper, zinc, selenium, our trace minerals, our vitamin E, our shortfalls. And the problem with sort of any plant that grows in the UK or anywhere in the world for that matter is it reflects the soil it's grown on. And in the UK, we're very short of things like selenium. In Scotland in particular, they have a real problem with basically no selenium whatsoever. But copper and zinc are the other two that we're typically very low in. Vitamin E, obviously an important vitamin E, and all of these are sort of have roles in antioxidants, muscle health and all that sort of thing. So if you are working your good doer, they do need these nutrients to keep them in good condition. So that's why we're suggesting using a source of vitamins and minerals, whether it's a balancer or a vitamin and mineral supplement. The top tips for the bucket feed, and this is something that people really struggle to sort of get their head around, and I can understand why. Remember that low sugar isn't necessarily low calorie. So if we're using oils and fats as an alternative, they are actually much higher in calories than the molasses that would give you the sugar. So an example would be in a chopped fibre ration. If you have a molasses-free option, like our high-fi molasses-free, we use a very light oil coating, but it does mean that it's a higher calorie feed than the high-fi light, which has a light molasses coating. So it is difficult to know which one is best. What I would suggest as a very simplified rule is that if you are really concerned about the insulin dysregulation and the amount of sugar, then you go for the low sugar option. If you're looking for the longer term management of a horse to get the weight off, where perhaps the insulin dysregulation and or the laminitis risk isn't quite so great, but they are overweight, then you might go for a little bit more sugar, but the lower calorie option. So there are two slight differences. But if you are struggling with that, speak to your feed line or nutritionist or whatever to help you just clarify which is best at a particular point in time. We look at percentages, the megajoules per kilo, but actually what matters is how much you're feeding, because if you are feeding the recommended level, particularly in the context of a balancer versus a high fibre cube, the feeding rate is much higher in a high fibre cube, and that will mean that you're going to get a lot more energy for the same level of vitamins and minerals that you need to balance the ration, and that's how a balancer effectively works. I'll come to that in 2 seconds. If you want more chew time in the bucket feed, then chopped fibre feeds typically weigh less in a scoop. So they help to satisfy that sort of need to chew and the appetite, and they increase the chew time compared to pelleted options. And it is important that you consider that when manufacturers of mixes and cubes describe them as a low energy or low calorie option, that is in the context of other mixes and cubes. But if you compare them to things like balancers or chopped fibres, they are not the lowest energy option in the whole sort of spectrum of horse feeds available. So yes, relative to other mixes and cubes, they're the low calorie ones, but not in the wider range of feeds available. And just to illustrate the point about how balancers work against a high fibre cube, you can see the high fibre cubes levels, the declarations in the green row, and then the balancer declarations are in the blue, and then the feeding rates. So with high fibre cubes, we need 2 kilos or 2,000 grams. whereas with a balancer we need about a quarter of that, which is 500 grams. So although on the surface the energy value on a megajoules per kilo basis is around the same, the feeding rate is what makes the difference. Now you can feed less of the high fibre cubes, you can reduce it down if you want, but then you're losing the bits that you do want, i.e. the copper. You're going to be falling way short of what the animal actually needs for a balanced diet. So their feeding rates are on there for a reason. They're to ensure that you get, or your horse gets, the vitamins and minerals that they need. So if you do feed less, then obviously the energy going in will be less, but so are all the other essential bits. So that's why a balancer works effectively. It's giving you all the bits you want without the things you don't. And what can we expect to achieve? So coming to the end, what are we trying to achieve with our weight loss strategies? Well, weight loss of around 0.5 to 1% of body weight a week is realistic. So that's 2.5 to 5 kilos a week for a 500 kilos horse, or around 0.5 to 0.75 kilos a day. That's a safe, steady weight loss that's going to progress you and keep you going in the right direction. Okay, now you may well be able to achieve greater weight loss than that, but you know it's likely to come at a price if you are having to reduce the amount of food you're giving to achieve that. So with all the things we've talked about, achieving that minimum 1.5% of body weight intake of food, then if you do that and take all the management steps we've suggested, you should be able to achieve weight loss of around 0.5 to 1% a week. For an average horse to change half a condition score, then we're looking at a weight loss of around 20 to 30 kilos. Now, it doesn't always follow like that, obviously, but people like to sort of have some comprehension of what it's going to take to get that shift in a condition score. So roughly 20 to 30 kilos, depending on the size of the horse and some of the various other factors that we need to consider. So I've put a chart on there to really show, this was Jake, we've used him quite a lot as a case study, but it still is a really impactful one because it conveys so many messages and gives you so much insight into what the challenges are. When we first saw him in the February, he was over 500 kilos. By the December, we managed to achieve a 99 kilos weight loss. Now, you can see in the spring and summer months, it becomes harder. He plateaued because when the grass is good and if you want to put them out, it is tougher to get the weight off. It's also generally warmer, so they're not using as much energy to keep warm. But the moral, I suppose, of the story is to use the winter months when the grass isn't so good, in theory, and you have that colder conditions, hopefully, to get them to use a little bit more energy to keep warm and lose some weight as a result. If we don't achieve that weight loss in the winter, it just keeps going up and up and up, and then we're in the situation of an obese horse or pony. And just why we should do this and why we need to take action is the fact that 99 kilos is around about 16 stone. And if we saw a 16 stone rider sat on a Connemara pony, which Jake is, for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, we'd do something about it. We wouldn't accept that. Whereas if we stand by and leave a pony carrying 99 kilos or 16 stone around, albeit their own body mass, we often don't take action, sadly, until it's too late, or we have what's been described as an awakening event, which usually is laminitis. So hopefully, that gives you some food for thought. I just put this on here because we have developed a LAMI risk calculator on the website, which you may find thought-provoking. It just highlights some of the key areas that increase the risk of laminitis. So, be honest, if you put it in, it's not an alternative to getting veterinary advice. It's just a bit of a way of trying to identify and highlight some of the key risk factors. And very quickly, because I'm conscious I've been talking for ages, sorry, just wanted to finish with a case study because he's not the typical fat native pony. And as Jen talked about, it can affect all horses of different shapes and sizes. This was Remy. He's primarily a para dressage horse, although he competes in dressage with able-bodied riders as well. He was longlisted for Tokyo 2020 with his rider Amanda Shirtcliffe. He was diagnosed with EMS, always been described as being chunky. Metformin isn't allowed under the FEI competition rules, even if you wanted to use it. So we had to try and get his weight off through dietary changes and weight loss strategies. Now, they've done some testing on him, and his insulin levels were such, and you'll see them in a minute, that basically, if it wasn't sorted out, there was no way he was going to Tokyo, whether he was the right choice or not for the team. So it was an important issue that the vets and the team supporting Amanda wanted to get sorted out, because there's no way he was going to be traveling to Tokyo in the condition he was in. So just to contradict everything I've just said, Remy can be very fussy and wouldn't eat anything with straw in. I think being a bit of a dressage diva, he felt that was beneath him. So we were challenged to try and find something relatively safe to use that he could be tempted to eat. So put all the hi-fi products to one side, we ended up having to go with Alpha A and a Performance Plus balance. Now the balance is appropriate because he is competing and working at a high level, so he needs that extra level of support. But Alpha A Original wouldn't have been our normal first choice, usually high fibre molasses free, but we went with the Alpha A Original because he would actually eat it. And we really like this case study because it highlights the importance of looking at the whole diet. So that go for broke, we've got to look at everything if we're going to get this situation resolved. Now here's another one where we analysed his hay, and this was his hay, came back at 36.8% WSC. The alternative lower sugar or water soluble carbohydrate option was 17.6, but yeah, you guessed it, that was the haylage or wrapped hay. So we did have a bit of a battle because instinctively no one in his support network wanted to put him on haylage, but of the two forages we had available to us, it was very much the hay that was the problem, and that was what he was actually on. So we battled on, we got him onto the haylage, we took him off the pasture altogether, and actually managed to achieve a reasonably significant weight loss. Now, unfortunately, he didn't make the team for Tokyo, but we got him into a much better condition. And sorry, it's not until this last slide that you can see his insulin levels. So he was 300, we got him down to sort of 91, which still had some way to go, but was a vast improvement on where he was. He's also, funnily enough, much more forward going, which Amanda likes. These sort of para dressage horses, although we want them safe and not spooky, they do need to be forward thinking to get these good results and make the grade for the Olympic level competition. So he was a much happier horse as a result, and you can see the sort of transformation over the period from Jan to August. Just one last plug, sorry, for an app that I've been working on with the University of Glasgow. So it's the EquiBCS app. It's free. It's on the Apple App Store and Google Play, but it allows you to condition score or body fat score your horses. You can store all the information. You can put multiple horses on there. You can put weight information on there, and you can also share it with your vet, your nutritionist, whoever you want to. So please do look at that. It's completely free. It's the EquiBCS University of Glasgow app, nothing to do with Dengi as such, just part of my PhD study. So it's a really useful tool, and if you can rate and review it, that would be brilliant, because we're gathering information on it. So thank you very much. And that's me done. So I will stop sharing, and hopefully Jen's there. I can see a couple of questions and chats and things have come through, and we'll see if we can cover those off. Brilliant. Hi, Jen. Sorry. You've been looking at the questions and things, or?
Yeah. So there's a longish one for me that I'm just puzzling my way through, but there was a short one for you, and the grey pony that you mentioned at the beginning of your chat.
Yes.
A lady just wants to know what was the body fat score on his before pictures. Would you say what conditional body fat score was he originally?
Brilliant, good question. Well, he had those creases in his neck. I wouldn't have said he was quite a 5, but I would be putting him probably somewhere around a 4.5, because he was, he had quite a lot of coat in that picture as well, but he was fat. So yeah, probably if we were being generous, a 4, and probably a 4.5 on a slightly harsher scale, depending on how, when you feel them, you can get a much better feel for what their fat coverage over their ribs and things is as well. But yes, he certainly had a long way to go.
Super. So I've been asked quite an interesting question actually about a lady with a horse with EMS lost 100 kilos and back into work. So first of all, amazing.
Well done.
Yeah, really, really well done for that. That's fantastic. She said he was on box rest for about 8 months due to laminitis and had lost a lot of muscle as well, which is inevitable. And she was happy with his weight at 530 kilos. He's 15.3 Welsh D. And he's now back in work, and actually his weight has increased despite the same management. The hay's soaked, 1 hour muzzle turnout a day. And basically she's asking, she expects a muscle gain, but how much to expect, how much weight to expect for muscle. He's currently up to 556 kilos, worked 30 to 45 minutes 5 times a week. I suppose, I don't know what you think about this, Katie, but I think this is where the body fat scoring or body condition scoring comes into its own, really. And to be honest, it's more important than the weight on the scales. Muscle does certainly add gain. It's hard for me to say how much muscle to expect. As I sort of alluded to in my talk, currently 30 to 45 minutes 5 times a week. Are we talking a hack? Are we talking dressage schooling? Are we talking jumping me to 30 courses? Or are we talking hunting or renting, or is it a racehorse? It's that sort of thing. What level of work is that? And that will really dictate how much muscle is going to be gained as to what sort of work we're doing and how vigorous that work is. But I would say that more importantly is the body fat scoring to see the condition, and that's always hard to do in something like this. But this is where I'm going to push for our weight clinic that we're doing on the 4th. So Monday next week, the 4th of April, we're doing a weight clinic at Newton Farm in Sturminster Marsh, and I'm sure some of you have come there before. That's going to be in the morning, and also at Luckham Riding School. And we're doing this currently with dengue as well. They're bringing a weigh bridge along so we can do some actual weighing, adding weight taping into that, and most importantly actually hands-on body condition scoring, because these webinars are fab, but there is nothing quite like standing in front of a horse, getting your hands on them and doing some body condition scoring, can answer anyone's question about feeding as well, and I will be there to answer any vetty questions and do sort of routine stuff, even blood sampling and things as well. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Katie.
I think it's quite interesting. One of my colleagues, Claire, who does a lot with the weigh bridge, she weighed some horses the night before. They then had feed withheld overnight, and then were having an ulcer endoscope for the ulcer risk the next morning, and they actually showed a weight loss of 20 kilos, which was effectively gut fill. So obviously they pooped overnight and not been taking anything in because they were being scoped the next day. So there are always lots of factors to consider. So 2 measurements in time, if you're seeing that trend continue, that they're gaining, obviously maybe take action, but you're spot on, Jen. The condition scoring or fat scoring is the key thing, and we all like weights because it's a bit like Weight Watchers, isn't it, for humans to get a round of applause if we've lost loads of weight, etc. But actually the fat scoring is the crucial bit. Now I think it was a 26 kilo difference, so that would be about a half a condition score if it was fat. So if you haven't seen them change or increase their condition score, then it is in all likelihood probably some muscle. But I don't think anyone has done the study at all to know how much muscle weighs compared to fat in terms of workload and all that sort of thing. So definitely the fat score is going to be the way to go to just make sure they're not putting on too much, for sure. But well done on the 100 kilos weight loss. That's brilliant.
I know, brilliant, really, really, really brilliant. It's fantastic effort, really good.
Are there any others? I wasn't sure if dressage schooling, I think the work is pretty hard work then, which is good, because there is hacking and there's hacking as well, isn't there?
Of course, no, there's nothing against hacking. I think like I was saying earlier, it's about getting that heart rate up as well, isn't it? And that can really help with with insulin dysregulation and of course burning calories as well.
Definitely. And it's yeah, if you can do hill work, I mean, we live in East Anglia and it's as flat as a pancake, but if you're based where there's a hill and have the luxury, you know, even walking up a hill just makes a big difference, doesn't it? So good old-fashioned hill work that we all used to do for our fitness, you know, getting animals fit. It's great for fat burning too. But I think that's all the questions.
Can I just quickly pose one for you, Katie? I'm just interested. So what would you say is the biggest sort of feeding myth that you come across that clients sort of bring to you? Or misconception, maybe.
Yeah, well, I think probably misinformation still is, you know, protein is the cause of all the evil is you know, a very regular occurrence. And you know, I in my lifetime as a, you know, pony club student, we always were talking about protein being the cause of laminitis, which, you know, I'm old, but I'm not that old. It was probably 30 years ago. So we have come a long way. So yes, in terms of laminitis, that's still kind of, that myth still abounds in places and for other problems as well. I think, yeah, probably it's hard, isn't it, in terms of, I don't do the feline as much, but yeah, probably the kind of which forage is best, and you can't use haylage, and that's why sort of in recent times I think these wrapped hays versus the haylage, and if you're going to use analysis, use information and do it, and you know, use the results, don't just kind of then ignore them because they weren't quite telling you what you thought they might or expected them to. But yeah, they're probably some of the biggest ones, I would think. And obviously protein again, and behavior, sort of feeding, making my horse go mad, which isn't quite so laminitis or obesity related. So, yeah, that's probably the biggest one.
And for those owners that say, gosh, but I need to feed more because when I ride my horse, he doesn't have any energy, he won't go forwards.
Yes. Oh, yeah, that's a really good one, actually. Yes, very common. In terms of, I've got an overweight horse that's lethargic. So what can I feed it to make it go forward more? Well, yeah, starting point is always a weight loss plan, and then making sure the diet's balanced, because again, a lot of people fall into the trap of using less of the horse and pony cubes, so they're not getting the balanced diet, they're not getting the vitamins and minerals they need, and they're all part of energy metabolism. So if you don't have those going in, it's like trying to, you know, run a marathon or run a race on a really poorly balanced diet. You're not going to do it. So balance the ration, get a weight loss plan, and then if you need some more energy genuinely, we can look at it. But yeah, first step is definitely weight loss and balancing the ration, for sure. But yeah, we had it was a good question last night about almost like 30 seconds in on what we're going to do to sort of try and get the showing industry to take note, because, and you know, address the obesity issue, because I think that is one of the industries where they are lagging behind a little bit. I think you know, there's still a lot of work to do there, but that's a bit of a minefield. If we, you know, if people are judging classes and things, they need to reward those horses that are a healthy weight, not the obese ones.
I've seen a few shows doing more like vet prizes and things, aren't they, for the horse at the healthiest weight, which is a nice start. But I agree, you know, more needs to be done, doesn't it?
Yeah, and you know, even in warm bloods, if you're sort of looking at some of these young horse classes in dressage and things, they are so heavy at, you know, 4 or 5 years of age, and these big sort of 17 plus 18 hand warm bloods take a very long time to mature, and all that pressure on their joints, immature joints as well. I mean, none of that can be good, and it doesn't have great prospects for their long-term careers either. So, you know, some of these dressage horses you would want to be competing hopefully for 13, 15 years maybe. Well, starting them off that fat and putting them under pressure at such a young age is not good. So I think, you know, there's probably some work to do there as well. But
yeah, absolutely, it's difficult for us as amateur riders because they're our role models at the end of the day, aren't they? You know, so yeah, absolutely, it'd be good if changes were made.
Yeah, and it's hard, isn't it? Because if you have horses and you want to compete, you know, this sort of whole, I suppose, a stereotype really of this big butch impressive animals, more likely to win, even in the dressage arena as well as showing. But the pressure's there to win, or if you're a producer and you want to produce young horses and success results, competitions, etc., it's not always the best start for these animals. So it's a bit contradictory, really, but I'm not sure until the sort of industries or the disciplines take action, we'll see much improvement. Oh, there's another question coming in. Question to Jen. 13.2 weight tapes at 380 and body condition score 4. Can I exercise that on a low pulse in the school? That's that's an interesting, definitely one for you, Jen.
So if there are pulses there, then there's inflammation within that hoof. And I would be worried about the stability of the pedal bone within there. I'll go back to my analogy about the Velcro. Inflammation means that that's becoming stretched, and therefore, by putting more strain on that, even on a soft surface in the school, I would be concerned about. I would want to get that inflammation down before we introduced exercise. Also, as well, things like schooling, even in a large school, there is more strain on not only joints but also the hooves themselves on circles. So when you're bringing your laminitis back into work once they have recovered from that, I would recommend start off on straight lines on soft surfaces as well to build them and see how those feet withstand it. I mean, I agree, we want to get them back into work as soon as possible, because it is that catch-22. If you can't exercise, then it is harder to get the weight off them and increase those calories going out, so to speak. But I would certainly get that under control to start with, and potentially, if we are struggling with muzzle turnout on only an hour, it might be worth, I don't know if you have done any testing on doing some of the blood testing that we talked about. I talked about earlier in the talk, to see what the insulin levels are, because that is going to tell us what the risk is for turnout on grass, and maybe it'd be better to implement a different strategy for whether it be a bare paddock or some of the things that Katie talked about earlier in hers as well.
It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because it's exercise, and if you're a bit fitty or you've got pulses and things, it's really hard to know what to do for the best. But
it is. And of course, if you're, I don't know if you're one of our clients or whatever, but I would say, a chat to you about maybe get a call out as well, and assess that and see people going back into work.
Lovely. Another one. Okay, she's been on metformin.
Yeah. Well, I suppose maybe this, for these cases that we are, we're doing the right thing, we're still struggling with either weight loss or sort of bouts of laminitis, because it might be a good time to consider some hay analysis. Going back to a little bit that Katie talked about, what is the hay you're feeding, what are those levels doing, are there any other options for forage, and again doing some analysis on those to see what the sugar levels are like. It might be even soaked, but they're fairly high, and that might be where we're struggling with that.
Yeah, and if you are, you can do it online if you do want us to do it for you, or there's lots of people do it now for you. So forage analysis is well worth looking at what you're dealing with. Great. Any more questions? Or